Heroes by Alan Gratz. And it starts with a note to the reader. It says, in order to accurately reflect the historical time period, some characters' dialogue in this book includes racially offensive language that was used in the United States during the 1940s. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, radio broadcast to the American people, December 29, 1940. Part 1. Before. The Arsenal of Democracy. Saturday, December 6, 1941. "It's an attack!" Stanley cried. "Enemy airplanes, dozens of them, coming in low over the water." "They're shooting machine guns," I added, turning in my seat. "Dropping torpedoes." "Fire, explosions, shrapnel everywhere," Stanley said. The water around us was a sparkling mirror, the sky bright blue without a cloud or plane in sight. My best friend, Stanley Summers, and I were sailing across Pearl Harbor in our little aluminum motorboat, heading home from baseball practice. Stanley was steering and I was sitting facing him. We were talking out a story idea for the superhero we were creating together. I was the writer and Stanley was the illustrator. It was going to be the greatest comic book ever. "And flying up to meet them," I went on, "is Warhawk, protector of the innocent, guardian of freedom. He smashes one plane with his fist and uses his heat vision to destroy another. Bullets ping off his chest." "Wait, Frank," Stanley cut in. "Warhawk has too many superpowers." I paused, confused. "What do you mean?" I asked. "He's got as many powers as Superman." "Superman's a cheat," Stanley said. "He's super strong and super fast. He can fly, he has X-ray vision, and super hearing, and super breath. It's boring." He shook his head. "Our character should have one superpower. Like how Captain America has super strength or the Flash has super speed." I leaned forward in my seat. "Oh, come on," I said. "You're telling me you'd rather be Captain America than Superman?" "Heck yeah," Stanley said. He took his hand off the tiller and gave me a crisp salute. "Stars and stripes, baby. Wouldn't it be amazing to get the super soldier serum?" I want to say yes, but Steve Rogers hadn't known what that super soldier serum was going to do to him before he took it. What if it had killed him or turned him into a monster? I wouldn't have taken that risk, not even for the chance to be Captain America. But I wasn't going to admit that to Stanley. I held tight to the sides of the boat as Stanley steered us toward Ford Island. A light breeze wafted the smell of pineapple and sugar cane across the bay, and the palm trees along the shore swayed. Somewhere, a radio played the soft, plinky sounds of Hawaiian ukulele music. In some ways, it felt like someone had already slipped me the super soldier serum. I'd grown 12 inches in the last year. Now, at 13 years old, I was taller than my mom. I was like one of those Charles Atlas ads you saw in the back of comics. Send for this free book and go from scrawny runt to Greek god in just 3 months. Only, I didn't feel like a Greek god. I was always tripping over my own big feet, and I felt clumsy and awkward in my new body. Stanley was the opposite. He was comfortable in his skin, with a casual confidence that I tried to copy, but could never quite get right. Like his clothes. While I wore a t-shirt and rolled-up jeans like most boys our age, Stanley stood out in his white shorts and oversized Aloha shirt with bright red flowers. He did his own thing and didn't worry what anybody thought of him. Stanley and I looked different in other ways, too. I was white, with skin that turned pink from sunburn, blue eyes, and wavy light brown hair. Stanley was a cross between his Japanese-American mom and his white dad, with tan skin, dark brown eyes, and straight black hair. But we were brothers, forever and always, thanks to our love of comic books. "How sold are you on the name Warhawk?" Stanley asked, pulling me out of my thoughts. Not particularly," I said. We'd taken his name from the type of fighter plane my dad flew in the Navy, but I'd never loved it. It made our hero sound like he was always looking for a fight. "You got any other ideas?" I asked Stanley. "No," he said. "You're the writer. I was hoping you had something." I thought about it as I looked across the water. Ringing Pearl Harbor like stone sentinels were the steel-gray battleships and cruisers and destroyers that made up the U.S. Pacific Fleet, all enjoying a lazy Saturday afternoon in port. The big ships gave me an idea. I turned toward Stanley, feeling a rush of excitement. "How about the arsenal of democracy?" I said. Something I'd heard President Roosevelt call the United States on the radio. There was a war happening overseas. Adolf Hitler, the evil leader of Nazi Germany, was trying to conquer all of Europe, maybe the world. Hitler had made a pact with Italy and Japan to form the Axis powers. Great Britain, Russia, China, and most of the other countries in the world, the Allies, were fighting against the Axis. But so far, America had stayed out of the war. We still wanted to help, so the U.S. had become the arsenal of democracy, cranking out ships and planes and tanks and guns to loan to the Allies. "I don't know," said Stanley. "It's kinda wordy." Stanley's lack of enthusiasm took some of the wind out of my sails, but I wasn't ready to give up. "It's like the Sentinel of Liberty," I argued, knowing how much Stanley loved Captain America's nickname. "And we can call our character Arsenal for short." "Okay, yeah," Stanley said, smiling as he came around. "And maybe he uses a shield, just like Cap. Something like this." Stanley pulled a pencil and paper out from his pocket and started sketching, which was a bad idea, because he was the one driving the boat. Near miss. "Stanley!" I cried, my voice so shrill it cracked. "Stanley, steer the boat!" Stanley got up, moved to the middle seat, and bent over his piece of paper. "You steer," he said, intent on his drawing. I gulped. Stand up in a moving boat? Cross the middle seat? Steer? I never steered. Without anybody to guide it, our boat swung slowly to the left, heading straight for the USS Nevada, a 580-foot-long, 30,000-pound battleship. That was not good, because when big boat hits little boat, big boat always wins. I fought to release my death grip on the sides of our boat and stood quickly, before I did something stupid like faint. I lurched over the middle seat like Frankenstein's monster and practically fell onto the seat at the rear of the boat. I almost went over backward into the water, but at the last second, I managed to grab hold of the tiller on the outboard motor. The boat swung wildly as I pulled myself back up and swerved us toward the dock on Ford Island. "Holy cats, Frank," Stanley said. He held his pencil up off his paper until the boat stopped rocking. "You okay?" "Great," I lied. "Just lost my balance for a second." Stanley nodded and went back to his drawing. I stared straight ahead, squeezing the handle on the tiller so hard my knuckles went white. I had to remind myself to breathe. How could Stanley do something like that to me? But then, Stanley didn't know the truth about me. The secret I'd kept carefully hidden since I'd first arrived in Hawaii a little over a year ago. The one thing I was desperate to not let anybody know. Worst case scenario. I was afraid of pretty much everything. Like right now, there were 100 ways to die at Pearl Harbor. I could drown if I fell over the side of the boat. That was why I insisted we always keep a life preserver on board. Of course, the outboard motor could chew me up before I ever got to use the life preserver, which would bring the sharks. Native Hawaiians said Pearl Harbor was home to a shark goddess and her son, and we'd all seen shark fins circling ships in the bay. Worse than the sharks were the giant eels. Everybody forgot about the giant eels. There were also stinging jellyfish and poisonous centipedes everywhere. But the whole territory of Hawaii was built on volcanic islands, and some of those volcanoes were still active. Maybe not on the island of Oahu, where Pearl Harbor was, but on the Big Island, which was close enough. A volcano had actually erupted on the Big Island just before my family and I moved here, filling the air with smog. Stanley kept sketching, and I focused on steering the boat and trying to stay calm. That had always been hard for me, ever since I was little. I was born cautious. I was the kid who always held the railing going downstairs, who waited until his hot cocoa was lukewarm cocoa so it wouldn't burn his mouth, who carried scissors upside down, fist wrapped tightly around the closed blades, and never, ever ran with them. And then, in 3rd grade, when my dad was stationed in Pensacola, Florida, came the incident. I shuddered even now, remembering it. The incident changed me from a kid who was careful to a kid who would do anything to never get hurt again. My constant fear had gotten so bad that sometimes I wouldn't leave the house unless I had to. But here in Hawaii, things had gotten much better. Much better. And a lot of that had to do with Stanley. When we were talking about comics and making up our own characters and stories, it was like I forgot to be afraid. And with a stupendous scribble here and a deftly drawn dimple there, Stanley said, putting down his pencil, the illustrious illustrator brings the arsenal of democracy to life. Stanley talked like that sometimes, like the narrator in a comic book. That was one of the great things about being friends with him. In his own way, Stanley was as much of an oddball as me. Stanley tried to hand me the drawing. "What do you think?" he asked. "Here, switch back," I said, and clumsily traded places with him so we could steer again. Once I was safely settled in the middle seat, I looked at his drawing. Stanley was an amazing artist. When I came to Hawaii, I'd had notebooks full of comic scripts and ideas I'd written down. But I couldn't draw, so I never thought I could actually make any comics. Not until I met Stanley. He'd drawn the Arsenal tall and muscular, wearing a white V-neck shirt with sleeves rolled up and a neckerchief like the ones U.S. sailors wore. He had on shorts like Captain Future and long gloves and boots with the tops folded down like Green Arrow. He looked Japanese-American like Stanley and wore a pair of goggles pushed into the mop of his black hair like Smiling Jack from the Sunday comics. He stood confidently with one hand on his hip while the other hand held something tall and narrow that tapered at both ends. "Is that a surfboard?" I asked. "Oh," said Stanley. "No, it's supposed to be a shield." "And what's this glow around him?" I asked. Stanley had drawn the Arsenal with a crackling force field, like the flames that surrounded the Human Torch or the electricity that sparked around the son of Professor Supermind. "I don't know," Stanley said with a shrug. "I just thought it looked swell." "It does. Maybe it's a force field that protects him and anybody he's close to." "Or maybe he has a magic surfboard he can fly around on," said Stanley. Maybe," I said. It wasn't quite right. Not yet. But it was fun figuring it out. Stanley pulled the boat up on the dock on Ford Island, and he leaped out like he'd done it 1,000 times before, which he had. Stanley had grown up in Hawaii. He'd been the one who explained to me that Pearl Harbor was both the body of water where the U.S. Navy's Pacific Fleet parked its ships, and the name of the whole military base. Ford Island, where we lived, was a little island in the middle of the harbor that was part of the base. The rest of Pearl, the fleet headquarters, repair docks, submarine base, barracks, and base hospital, filled the coastline all around the harbor. I stood up shakily in the boat and tried to focus on the towering green mountains in the distance. Pearl Harbor was about 10 miles due west of the city of Honolulu, on the island of Oahu, one of the many islands that made up the U.S. territory of Hawaii. Everyone on Ford Island called Oahu the mainland, which was super confusing. To me, the real mainland was the continental United States, which was 5 days away by ship. Because Hawaii sat smack dab in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, a third of the way between the U.S. and Japan. Stanley held the boat while I climbed out, which I managed to do without imagining all the bad things that would happen to me if I slipped and fell. "Okay," I said. "Now that we've got a name and a look for our superhero, he needs an origin story." "That?" Stanley said as he tied the boat up. "He crawls through a cave with magic crystals in it or something and he gets superpowers. Easy." "No, I don't mean how he gets his powers," I said as we started walking toward home. We were due at Stanley's house for an early dinner with our families. Once the Arsenal has his powers, why does he decide to be a hero? "Like Bruce Wayne deciding to fight crime as Batman because his parents were killed by a mugger?" asked Stanley. "Exactly," I said. "Getting superpowers is one thing. Choosing how to use your powers is another. That's what an origin story is." We headed along the one road that ringed Ford Island. To our left, a row of houses separated us from the blue water and the parked battleships. To our right, beyond some palm trees and administrative buildings, a patrol bomber took off from the runway at Ford Island Naval Air Station, where our dads worked. "Maybe the Arsenal is the son of a sea king," Stanley suggested. "He surfs around the coast, righting wrongs." "Or he lives in Atlantis," I said, "and a huge kraken destroys the city and eats his entire family, so he goes on a one-man crusade to rid the seas of giant monsters." Stanley chuckled. "You always come up with the worst things to happen to our characters." "I guess I do," I said, forcing a laugh. If Stanley only knew. A green U.S. Navy fighter plane zoomed overhead, and Stanley and I waved. The pilot responded by tipping his wing down at us. We couldn't see his face, but he must have been someone Stanley and I knew through our dads. I smiled as we kept walking. Then I froze. Just ahead, under a huge old banyan tree, 2 boys named Arthur Edwards and Johnny Ross were hovering threateningly over a younger boy named Charlie Moore. Stanley and I knew all 3 boys. The school we went to on the mainland was small, and the community of military families here on Ford Island was even smaller. Charlie was a grade younger than us and played saxophone in the school band. Arthur and Johnny were in 9th grade, and they were bullies. When I'd moved to Pearl Harbor, Arthur and Johnny had picked on me like they picked on everyone. But then something strange had happened. As I'd gotten bigger and stronger, I'd gotten better at sports, which made me popular. Suddenly, kids like Arthur and Johnny and their friends started saying hey to me in the halls. And I was pretty sure Arthur's younger sister, Maxine, who was in my grade, was sweet on me. Which was new, too. I didn't know how to handle it, any of it, so I just avoided them, Arthur and Johnny most of all. "Hey, McCoy," Johnny said to me now, and Arthur raised his chin to acknowledge me. "Hey," Stanley said, even though they had conspicuously not said hello to him. He frowned. "What's going on?" It was perfectly clear what was going on. Arthur and Johnny had found some excuse to pick on Charlie, and Stanley and I both knew that the best way to not have them pick on us, too, was to keep on walking. "Come on, Stanley," I said. "Let's get home." "Charlie stole my bike," Arthur said, grinning. A red bicycle lay on its side among the roots of the banyan tree. A red bike we all knew belonged to Charlie. "I did not!" Charlie cried. "This is my bike!" "Pretty sure he's right," said Stanley. "Pretty sure you should mind your own business," Johnny told him. I didn't like where this was going. There were 100 ways this could end badly. 1,000. And in almost every case, someone was going to get hurt. "Stanley, don't," I said. But he was already stepping up close to Arthur and Johnny. "Beat it, creep," Johnny said, and gave Stanley a shove. "Pick on somebody your own size," Stanley said, and he shoved Johnny right back. "Stop! Don't!" I yelled, blood thundering like battleship guns in my ears. Things were spiraling out of control, and fast. Arthur threw a punt to the side of Stanley's head, and Stanley staggered back and kicked at Arthur's shins. Johnny tried to get Stanley in a headlock, and suddenly it was 2-on-1. I ducked and cringed with each punch, but I stayed rooted to my spot like the big banyan tree. I wanted to help, but I didn't want to get hurt. Not again. Charlie used the distraction to run away, abandoning his bike. "Wait!" Stanley called after him. Johnny hit Stanley in the stomach when he wasn't looking. While Stanley was doubled over in pain, Arthur snatched up Charlie's bike, hopped on, and started pedaling away as fast as he could. Johnny sprinted after him, laughing all the way. Stanley picked up a rock and hurled it as the boys as they fled, but it missed them by a mile. The danger gone, my feet became unstuck from the ground. I hurried over to Stanley, but he pushed my hands away. "What the heck, Frank?" Stanley said. His voice was angry and wounded, his left eye swollen. "You're bigger than both of those guys. You could have beat them if you'd helped me. Why didn't you?" I knew the reason. It was because of the incident. Because I was afraid of getting hurt. Stanley stood there and waited for me to say something. Anything. When I couldn't, he turned and stalked off for home. Backyard battleships. Stanley didn't say another word for 10 whole minutes, which is like Captain Marvel not saying Shazam for an entire issue. I glanced sideways at him as we walked, trying to see if he was sore at me or sore for taking punches. Probably both. I cursed inside. For a whole year, I had managed to hide how afraid I was from everybody in Hawaii, but now it was going to be Pensacola, Florida all over again. After the incident, when kids at school had seen how scared I was of everything, they made merciless fun of me, called me lily-livered, yellow-bellied, chicken. After that, nobody dared to be my friend. When the Navy moved my dad and the rest of the Pacific Fleet here to Hawaii last year, I got a chance to start over. I swore I'd never let anybody see my fear, and it had worked. Until now. Now, Stanley had seen the real Frank McCoy. We turned into Stanley's house, which was right next door to mine. Everybody called the row of bungalows we lived in Nob Hill, like the swanky neighborhood in San Francisco. It was a joke because we were Navy families, not rich snobs. We all lived in small 2-bedroom houses, and the only hill was under Admiral Bellinger's quarters, which sat on top of the old First World War concrete bunker. All the Ford Island kids loved to play in that bunker. We called it the dungeon. Right then, I wish I could disappear into the dungeon and never come out again. Mrs. Summers, Mom, and my big sister Ginny were setting the table as we walked through Stanley's front door. Stanley's mom was pretty in a floral print sundress, her black hair cut short. My mom wore a blue dress in the same style, and her blonde hair was up in a bun. Ginny, as usual, wore a short-sleeved blouse and pants. Mrs. Summers gasped when she saw the state Stanley was in. "What happened to you?" she asked. Nothing, Stanley lied. We need to get these cuts cleaned up at once, my mom said, taking Stanley's elbow and leading him to the bathroom. The other Navy families on Ford called Mom Commodore McCoy because of the way she took charge whenever there was anything that needed doing. Mitsuko, Mom called to Mrs. Summers, where is your iodine? To Ginny, she said, bring some ice and a hand towel so we can keep the swelling down on this bruise around his eye. I smelled meat cooking on the grill out back and tried to slip away, but Ginny was too fast for me. She left a tray of ice on the counter and stopped me in my tracks. Frank, she whispered, have you and Stanley been fighting? What? Me and Stanley fighting? No, I protested. Ginny had been my one constant friend through our family's many moves. She knew me better than anyone else, even better than our mom, and the squinty look she was giving me now said she knew something was up. Then what's going on between you two? I shook my head and swallowed. I couldn't tell her, couldn't admit what a coward I'd been. Ginny sighed. Listen, bub, we moved to a tiny island in the middle of a harbor of a slightly less tiny island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, where the nearest other girl my age is a 30-minute boat ride away, she reminded me. But you, Frank McCoy, you got lucky. You moved in right next door to a kid who's not just the same age as us, but who likes all that comic book stuff you're into. You know how rare that is for us? Ginny was right. It was hard for Navy kids to make friends and keep them. Not that I wanted to talk about any of this with her now. You better get that ice to Mom before it melts, I said. Ginny turned, and in the split second she was distracted, I slid past her and went outside. Mrs. Summers and my dad stood at the small portable grill in the backyard alongside Ginny's boyfriend, Brooks Leonard. Dad held a spatula to flip the burgers sizzling on the grate, and all three of them held bottles of golden beer that perspired in the sun. The burger smelled great, but I kept my distance from the hot flames and popping grease. Frank, my dad called, waving me over. Dad was a big, tall guy with a clean-shaven face and short, sandy brown hair. Off duty this afternoon, he wore an Aloha shirt, khaki slacks, and white loafers. How you doing, Stretch? Brooks asked me with a smile, and I couldn't help but smile back. Brooks was a seaman second class on the USS Utah and the power-hitting catcher for the ship's baseball team. Sailors who lived on their ships like Brooks couldn't keep civilian clothes on board, so he was wearing a white uniform and cap today, even though he was off duty. In the 10 months he and my sister had been dating, Brooks had become the older brother I'd never had, and I secretly hoped he and Ginny would get married and make the situation permanent. Where's Stanley? Mr. Summers asked me. Stocky and muscular, Mr. Summers had a neatly trimmed black mustache and colorful tattoos that peeked out from under his shirt sleeves. Stanley's dad was a flight crew chief at the air station, so he was in charge of fixing and maintaining the planes my dad flew as a pilot, which meant my dad's life was literally in Mr. Summers' hands every day. I frowned and looked at the ground. He's inside getting cleaned up. I heard the screen door creak open behind me and I cringed, expecting it to be Stanley. It was only Ginny, though, back from her errand for Mom. She walked over to Brooks and wrapped her arm around him. Brooks and Ginny looked like a couple, both tall and tan with brown hair turned golden by the Hawaiian sun. They'd met because Ginny was a huge baseball fan. She was a pretty good player, too. When she was a kid, she'd played on the base youth baseball teams when there weren't enough boys to fill the rosters. Ginny had graduated from high school last spring and had a job in the secretarial pool at Dole Pineapple in Honolulu. Don't get me wrong, Hawaii's a paradise, Dad said to Mr. Summers, continuing a conversation I had apparently interrupted. But I didn't become a Navy pilot to sit on my hands out here in the Pacific while the war is happening in Europe. I want to be in the fight. I sighed. Of course, they were talking about the war. It was what everybody talked about all the time now. What business is it of ours? Mr. Summers said. The countries of Europe have been fighting each other for thousands of years. The last time we stuck our noses in, my dad and a bunch more guys came home with missing arms and legs. Dad got a distant look in his eyes, and I knew he was thinking about how close he'd come to fighting in the First World War. As a young man, Dad had enlisted and was training to hunt U-boats and seaplanes when the war ended in 1918. Dad had once admitted to me how lucky he was to have missed out on the bloodiest war in human history, which was why it was so surprising to me that he wanted to fight now. 100,000 soldiers never came home at all, Ginny said, looking up at Brooks. Exactly, said Mr. Summers. And for what? Nothing changed, and now they're fighting all over again. I say we stay out of it." "You and half the U.S.," said Brooks. I nodded. Everywhere you went in Hawaii, people talked about how they didn't want to go to war. If the radio was right, most people from California to Connecticut felt the same way. And I agreed with them. Maybe the only thing I feared more than getting hurt myself was seeing somebody I loved get hurt. And everybody I loved was connected somehow to the Navy. "Frank, toss me another beer," Dad said, and I went to the cooler to fish out some of the half-melted ice. I was worried about all the things that could go wrong lobbing a wet bottle at my dad. A vision of clonking him in the head with an 80-mile-an-hour submarine pitch came immediately to mind, but I swallowed my nervousness and threw him the bottle. It sailed through the air in a perfect arc, and Dad caught it without having to budge. He gave me an impressed smile as he popped the cap. It was silly, but I swelled with pride. Dad and I had never been close. He kept trying, taking me on father-son outings like going deep-sea fishing or climbing to the top of a volcano or flying around the islands in a Navy seaplane. But I was always too scared to enjoy myself. Still, I loved Dad for making the effort. He wasn't ready to give up on me, and I wasn't ready to give up on him. "What do you think about the war?" Mr. Summers asked, turning to Brooks. Brooks smiled. "I just want to finish my tour and come home and play baseball." "Nothing else?" Ginny asked flirtatiously. "Like start a family, maybe?" Brooks blushed, and the rest of us laughed. "She's got your number, kid," Dad said, giving Brooks the same smile he'd given me. I clearly wasn't the one who hoped Brooks and Ginny would get married. "Well," Mr. Summers said, taking a sip from his bottle, "we'll be fighting the Japanese over here before we know it." "You think so?" I asked, my stomach tying itself into a knot. Ginny shrugged. Why else would Uncle Sam have sent Dad to Hawaii? I knew that my dad and the rest of the Pacific Fleet had been moved to Pearl Harbor because Japan had invaded half of Asia while everybody was busy with Germany. Now, the radio said that the Japanese were threatening to expand east, toward the United States. But I hoped it wouldn't come to war. Dad shook his head. "No way. Pearl is a fortress. They'd never attack here." Standing in the shadow of a gigantic battleship parked offshore, it was hard to disagree with him. Each dreadnought was as long as the Washington Monument laid on its side, and their steel hulls rose tall and gray like skyscrapers. The Arizona, the Tennessee, the West Virginia, the Oklahoma, the Maryland, and those were just the ones I could see from where I stood. Everybody called it Battleship Row. To me, it was a lineup of superheroes as big and powerful as the Justice Society of America, and it sat 200 yards from my back door. Dad flipped the burgers with a spatula, making flames shoot up as grease dripped into the coals. "Frank, grab the buns behind the cooler and lay them on the grill to toast," he said. To anybody else, that might have been a simple request, but for me, it triggered a quiet panic. Put hamburger buns on the grill? With my bare hands? What if the charcoal flared up and scorched me? What if I accidentally touched the grill and burned my fingers? What if hamburger grease popped into my eyes and blinded me? I took a bun out of the bag and got as close as I dared to the heat radiating off the grill. I held the bun as far away from me as I could and nudged it onto the grill. I didn't nudge it far enough, though, and it fell off onto the grass. "Frank," Dad said. "Well, I'm in no hurry to fight anybody," Mr. Summers said, going on like I hadn't just been asked to risk my life for the sake of toasted buns. I pulled another bun from the bag, took careful aim, and gave this one an underhanded toss like the one I had with Dad's beer. It sailed through the air and landed perfectly between two hamburgers. Ha! "What about helping the people of Europe?" Ginny asked Mr. Summers. "Your dad said it. This is paradise," Mr. Summers argued. "Why would we give that up to go fight in somebody else's war?" I took out another bun and held it ready. I focused on where I wanted it to land, and I flipped it end over end toward the grill. The bun slipped perfectly between the grates and landed right on top of the coals, where it burst into flames. "Oh, for crying out loud, Frank," Dad said, giving me an exasperated look. He took the bag of buns from me, and in 10 seconds flat, he had the rest of them laid out on the grill. By hand. I shrank away, Dad's earlier pride in me gone like the tide. I didn't have to look at her to know Ginny was rolling her eyes. "How's the food coming?" Mom called from the door. "We're starving in here." "Everybody go in." Dad said, putting hamburgers on the plate. "I'll be right there." I followed Mr. Summers and Brooks inside slowly, nervous about seeing Stanley again. Ginny held me back and gave me the stink eye. "Whatever's going on between you and Stanley, fix it," she whispered. I nodded. I would fix it, if Stanley let me. After I got cleaned up, I went to the dining table. I liked the little alcove where it was set because that's where Stanley's mom displayed her Japanese family heirlooms. They were color woodblock prints of Mount Fuji, a famous snow-covered volcano just outside Tokyo. Framed, sepia-toned pictures of Mrs. Summers' Japanese ancestors, the men and women wearing kimonos and looking serious. And the real showstopper, an honest-to-goodness samurai sword with a fancy diamond-pattern hilt and a polished lacquer scabbard. I couldn't help but stare at it. "That katana belonged to my great-great-grandfather," Mrs. Summers told me proudly as she sat down. "My grandfather brought the sword with him when he moved to Hawaii." I nodded. I knew most of the story because Stanley loved to show off the katana to anyone and everyone who visited. It was rare for Japanese Americans to live on base. Most of the servicemen and their families here at Pearl Harbor were white. Off base, though, it was almost the opposite. There were way more Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders than there were white people in the rest of Hawaii. There, my family and I were in the minority. Stanley slunk into the room and sat down at the table. Our moms had cleaned him up, and he'd changed his shirt, but he had a big black bruise around his left eye that didn't look like it was going away anytime soon. "Ouch," my dad said, sitting across from Stanley. "I hope the other guy looks worse." Stanley shrugged. "I tried," he said. And Frank didn't. The unspoken truth lurked between us like Kent Thurston, the invisible hood. There was only one seat left for me at the table, and that was next to Stanley. He didn't look up at me as I sat down, staring at the empty plate in front of him instead. The silence that surrounded Stanley and me grew bigger and bigger until it swallowed the adults at the table too. I could sense them looking at each other and wondering what was wrong, but knowing better than to ask. Ginny was right. I needed to fix this. I wanted to fix this, but I didn't know how. Not without telling Stanley everything, which could mean losing him for good. "Hey guys," Brooks said to Stanley and me, acting like he couldn't tell there was something going on. "Why don't you both come by the Utah tomorrow morning before the big baseball championship? I'll give you a tour of the ship, and then we can go to the game together. What do you say?" I didn't know whose idea it was, his or Ginny's, but the invitation was clearly designed to bring Stanley and me back together. I hardly ever got to set foot on a working battleship, so I should have been excited by Brooks's offer. Would have been excited, except that I was too busy worrying that I'd lost my best friend. "That'd be swell," I said flatly. "Sure, Brooks," said Stanley. "Thanks." Our answers seemed to make the adults think everything was fixed, and they got to passing the food around and talking about the war again. It was my turn to say something to Stanley, to explain why I'd let him fight Arthur and Johnny alone, but I still couldn't do it. "Hey," I said instead, "maybe the Arsenal's origin story has to do with him being a sailor on a battleship. We could see something on our tour tomorrow to put in our comic." "Really, Frank?" said Stanley. He looked at me for the first time since the fight, and this time it was like I was a stranger. "How do you think you can write about heroes if you can't be one yourself?" Invincible, Sunday, December 7th, 1941. Stanley's words were still ringing in my head the next morning as we rode across Pearl Harbor. I blinked, bleary-eyed, at the bright sun rising over the submarine base. I'd stayed up too late last night, replaying yesterday's events like they were scenes from the movie the sailors were watching on the fantail of the USS Arizona just offshore. I hadn't been able to see the screen, but I could hear the soundtrack through my open window, see the flicker of blue-white light. If only I could rewrite yesterday's script, change the action and the dialogue, and recast myself as the hero. But it was too late. That was a wrap on me and Stanley. Stanley leaned back in the boat, closing his eyes and spreading his arms wide. "Another beautiful day in paradise," he said with a smile. "You got that right, kid," said the sailor on the tiller. Stanley and I couldn't exactly take our little motorboat to the Utah and leave it tied to a battleship, so we were riding in one of the Navy motor launches that puttered around the harbor. I held fast to my side of the boat, trying to not look too uneasy as we bounced across the water. It was early, Most of Pearl Harbor was still asleep as we came around the east side of Ford Island, past the hospital ship Solace. I glanced over at Stanley. After he'd dropped that bomb on me at dinner, I'd finished my hamburger as fast as I could and hurried home. I hadn't said a word to anybody or come out of my room again until this morning. To my surprise, Stanley had met me at the pier in his usual good spirits, talking about how excited he was for our battleship tour. The black eye he'd gotten yesterday was full-on purple now, and as big as a baseball. Otherwise, it was like nothing had happened, which I couldn't believe. Stanley was pretty easygoing, but was all really forgiven? His disappointment and anger had to still be there, lurking under the surface like a shark or a giant eel. I remembered Florida and how my friendships there had died slow and painful deaths. First, Stanley would be too busy to hang out one weekend. Then he would start taking the ferry home from baseball practice instead of us riding together in his boat. Then he would stop sharing his comics with me and tell me he'd already read the ones I'd offered to share with him. Then he would find somebody else to draw the superheroes with. Stanley opened his good eye and looked at me. "You know the best part about going to the Utah?" he said. "No Japanese school." While I got to sleep in and eat pancakes and read comic books on Sundays, Stanley's mom made him go into Honolulu after church for Japanese school. Stanley was always griping about how they made him learn Japanese and all these Japanese tradition things, like how to arrange flowers and pour tea. Japanese school was one of Stanley's favorite topics to complain about, even though his grandmother taught the classes. "That's good," I said cautiously, still waiting for Stanley to drop the act and tell me we were through as friends. Instead, he leaned forward. "Hey, I was thinking about the arsenal last night," Stanley said. "Maybe he's some kind of space ranger." I blinked. "You want to talk about our comic book?" I asked. "But I thought you said—" I bit the rest of that sentence off. Yesterday, Stanley had questioned my worthiness to write superhero comics. But if he was over it today, maybe that meant our friendship hadn't imploded like Krypton. "Sure," I said cautiously. "Maybe the Arsenal is the guardian of his planet and defends it against alien invaders." "He should definitely protect his own planet," Stanley said. "But he should travel to other planets and fight for other people too. A real hero steps in when they see people getting hurt, no matter what." Ah, there it was. Stanley had only brought up the Arsenal to hammer home his point about me. He hadn't let it go after all. He'd just been waiting to drop a lightning bolt on me like Shock Gibson. I shrank against the side of the boat. We were really over, me and Stanley. I wished suddenly that I would fall overboard, and that a giant eel would just eat me and put an end to it. "That's what superheroes do," Stanley said, talking on like he hadn't just killed me. "That's what makes Superman so awesome." I stared at Stanley, trying to see the spite behind his eyes. That's what he was doing, wasn't it? Rubbing it in? I'd seen nastiness in the eyes of kids back in Florida when they made fun of me. Cruelty. But it was weird. There was none of that in Stanley. Not that I could see, at least. "I thought you didn't like Superman," I said warily. "He has too many powers," Stanley said. "But I do like that he uses his powers to help people who are in trouble for no other reason than it's the right thing to do." Okay, I thought, I get it. I looked away with a frown. Our boat rounded the north end of Ford and turned down Carrier Row, headed for the Utah. Carrier Row was where the Navy's aircraft carriers were usually parked. Today the Utah and the light cruisers Raleigh and Detroit were docked there because the carriers were all out at sea on patrol. A couple of civilian bum boats had pulled up alongside the Navy ships to sell newspapers and cigarettes and treats, and a launch with sailors dressed up for church gave friendly salutes to a passing boat filled with groggy sailors coming back from a night out partying in Honolulu. Otherwise, most everybody else not on duty was sleeping in. I looked at Stanley again. I had to explain why I hadn't fought with him yesterday, so he'd understand. But before I could build up the courage to speak, the launch came alongside the Utah. Stanley and I climbed a ladder on the port side of the ship and tried to think of anything besides falling into the water and getting crushed between the hulls of the battleship and the launch. I reminded myself that port meant left on a ship when you were facing the front, and starboard meant right. Today, the Utah was parked so that the port side faced the harbor and Ford Island was to starboard. "That's my guys. Oh, there's my guys," Brooks Leonard said as we came aboard. "Right place, right time." He smiled and shook our hands like we were adults. Brooks had on his white baseball uniform with the word Utah written in cursive on the chest. Not many of the other Utahs were up and about. Amidships, a sailor in white shorts and a white t-shirt sat on an air vent with his legs up on the rail, reading the Sunday comics. Farther aft, the Utah's band had assembled, ready to play the national anthem when the color guard raised the American flag. Despite the tension with Stanley, I felt an electric thrill standing on the deck of a real battleship. It was just so big and solid. Every inch of the Utah was wood and steel. It felt powerful, invincible, like the safest place in the world. I wanted to never leave. "Let me give you guys the grand tour," Brooks said, waving for us to follow him. "The Utah's a battleship, but it's an old one. She was decommissioned from fighting after the First World War. She weighs more than 31,000 tons, and from stem to stern, she's about 1.5 football fields long. Freshly scrubbed teak decks stretched out in every direction, and enormous wooden covers shrouded what must have been the Utah's guns. Round gray air vents sprouted from the deck like metal mushrooms, and ropes and chains were coiled everywhere I looked. Hatches and doorways led to stairs and ladders that disappeared into the decks below, and the outside edge of the deck was ringed with rope railings. Brooks explained that the Utah was only used for anti-aircraft gun training and target practice now. "We cover the decks with loose lumber, and planes drop dummy bombs on us," he said, putting his hand on a big stack of timbers as thick as tree trunks. "These protect the real deck and show the pilots where they hit," he laughed. "Pretty funny, huh? I joined the Navy, and the only people shooting at me are other Navy guys." Stanley was totally focused on what Brooks was saying, but I was still distracted. Stanley was the best friend I'd ever had, and I couldn't bear the thought of him thinking less of me. I had to make things right with him. It was time to tell him why I was the way I was. Brooks asked us to follow him to the rear of the ship, and I saw my chance. "Stanley, I'm sorry about yesterday," I said. Stanley stiffened. "It doesn't matter," he said. "It does to me," I said. "I didn't mean to. You see, a few years ago, Dang it, I wasn't saying it the way I wanted to say it. See, back when I lived in Florida, there was this incident," I started, but I didn't get a chance to finish. Because that was the moment the whole world turned upside down. Meatballs. "Whoa! Look at all those planes!" a sailor on deck cried. Stanley and Brooks and I turned around. Coming in low from the northwest, from the direction of Pearl City, was a whole squadron of fighters, dozens of them, broken up into flights of 4 planes each. I could hear the buzz of their engines echoing across the water. "That's weird," said Brooks. "The carriers send planes in for tune-ups on Ford, but never that many at once." Boom. The sound made us all jump, and Stanley and I raced to the starboard side of the ship. A fiery explosion erupted on the south end of Ford Island, and I gasped. That was near the seaplane ramp. 8 or 9 planes dove and circled in the air above the explosion, and I flinched as there was another boom, and another, and another. A hard, tightening knot grew in my stomach as black smoke and flames rose from the island. Something about this was not right. Brooks and a few other sailors came over to watch with us, but they didn't seem troubled. "Maneuvers? On a Sunday?" a sailor said. "What are those papayas at headquarters thinking?" "All the damn times to have a drill," said another. It was true that the Army and Navy ran exercises like this all the time, with fake bomb explosions and anti-aircraft guns firing blanks as planes buzzed the airfields and docks. But something about all this felt off, and it wasn't just the timing. "Those look like real bombs they're dropping," I said. "No," said Brooks. "They would never." "They hit the water tower," Stanley cried. I turned to see flames explode up from the base of Ford's Island water tower, and we all gasped as it toppled to the ground. "Oh, somebody's going to catch hell for that," said one of the sailors. "This is the best damn drill the Army has ever put on," Brooks said with a grin. He was right, if it was a drill. The sound of droning planes drowned out the Utah band playing the national anthem, and the back of my neck tingled. This didn't feel like a drill, but what else could it be? Suddenly, one of the planes pulled up out of its bombing dive and zoomed right toward us. It buzzed the Utah's conning tower, flashing by so close and so fast that everyone ducked. Stanley waved to it, like we always did to the pilots flying around Pearl. But I didn't. I was too busy trying to see the markings on the underside of the plane's wings. A shiver ran through me, and I grabbed Stanley's arms. "Stanley, come on!" I yelled over the sound of more explosions, pulling him back toward the port side of the ship. "What is it?" he asked. "Those planes," I said. "I think I saw a meatball." "A meatball?" Stanley cried. We ran to the rail where the sailor who'd been reading the funny papers stood staring. More planes filled the air, swooping and diving and dropping more bombs. A geyser of water shot up across the harbor and splashed down. I couldn't believe what was happening. Another plane buzzed by so close we could almost have touched it, and I grabbed Stanley's arm again and pointed. There, painted on the bottom of the plane's wings, were the meatballs I thought I'd seen before, the round red circles that formed the rising sun of the Japanese flag. "Stanley, it's not a drill," I yelled in his ear. "It's a Japanese attack!" Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a day which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed to the Joint Session of Congress, December 8, 1941.